Everyone, my name is Allison Mell. I am a pediatric physical therapist for those of you who don't know me. And we are going to wait till Paige jumps on. I am so excited to get her on. Okay, great. All right. Hi, everybody. We are waiting. There we go. There's Paige. Hello.
Hi.
Hi there. I am so excited to chat with you today about lots of different topics. So nice to actually connect and I'm so excited to dive in.
Thanks for having me. Me too.
Absolutely. So we, discussed talking about a really important topic that we both talk about a little bit differently, but I think is something that comes up all the time with parents all the time, right? And that is how to keep our kids safe. How do we let them take risks and how do we navigate that with our partners? Because
hmm
we sometimes come to the table with different perspectives.
Sure.
Yeah, and I know you've talked a little bit about that, about how often dads are often the big risk takers and like, let's go, right? They don't need helmets and moms are often the ones who are a little bit more cautious and like, let's make sure that we're safe. And I guess you've seen that a lot and discussed that a lot with moms and maybe had that yourself.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it shows up that much in my relationship. I think, what I have found is that, as we know, moms tend to take on the bulk of the mental load when parenting. And a part of that often is meeting developmental milestones, making sure they're keeping their kids safe, communicating with pediatricians or the school, for example. And so I often think about, I feel like one that comes up all the time is like grapes, right? Where women are like, we have to cut the grapes. And men are like, what are you talking about? They're fine. They'll chew them. And as a mom, I've gone to a lot of doctor's appointments where they say, please cut the grapes. And the daycare sends me emails that says, please cut the grapes. And that's not about risk, right? Like that is different
Yeah.
than risk. But what you often hear in the narrative is like men are more willing to put their kids in risky situations and let them figure it out. And women are less likely to. And I think one of the reasons we have that is because women and you probably could speak to this even more than I can, but women tend to be inundated with information and how to do it right and how to be the best mom and how to keep your kids safe. And so there's this added pressure, I think, in regards to risk taking that women have less tolerance for because they are also being kind of held to a different standard in parenting as to how did you let them get hurt versus dad, which is like he's being a fun dad. You let them take a risk, right? And that's what dads are for.
Yeah, you see that a lot of times in a pool setting, right? The dad's the one
Mm,
that's throwing the kids into the pool. The dad's the one with the kids on the shoulders, right? And like,
yeah,
I know I was a lifeguard for many years, just as like a fun summer thing, but also as a mom now, I'm like, but I've seen those occasions when, that one time where someone was pushed into a pool and they ended up with a spinal cord injury, right? Like
yeah.
we as the moms are definitely, as you say, we're the ones that are often going to those pediatrician appointments. And it seems like somehow it seeps into our algorithm a lot of these cases where there was something that happened or what the recommendation is for foods or safety precautions. And one of the other things that I think you talk about, which is so important, is also, let's say your kid is at the playground and you
hmm
are standing back, you're watching, but you're letting them go, right? And they do fall off because kids fall, right? And you go to the emergency room and it's very it's common. I've been there myself where as a mom I feel like I'm being judged for how my child ended up in this situation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's a big fear for a lot of women. Your child falls and they break their arm. Well, were you paying attention? Right. And so there's that layer of judgment for sure. Yeah. And I think more than ever, I don't know how you feel on this topic, but I think with the risk part, which is we just have heard too many stories, right? Because of social media and just the way the media in general works these days, that maybe I think like when I was growing up in the 90s, you didn't hear about that one random spinal cord injury in the pool because you didn't know about it. It wasn't your community. You didn't have that insight. And so you were less likely to be aware of it and then taking precautions to avoid it. Now, we hear of everything constantly. Did you see that video on TikTok, right? Did you see this? Did you see that story? And so we're also constantly kind of mitigating risk based on what we know, which I
Yeah.
think is much more than we used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's that other side of like how, you hear those people are like, right, it's not actually common for these things to happen. Like now we know about those one-off cases,
Yeah.
but are they actually like real concerns that we have to worry about all the time because there's always a risk, but and so how do we balance that out of being cautious, feeling like we're the ones responsible for our children's safety, right? And then there's also that part of me as when I put my PT hat on, I like kind of move the mom hat off and I put my, developmental specialist hat on, so to speak, of I really do find that allowing our kids to take healthy risks is also so important for them, right? And climbing that jungle gym and jumping off the diving board and all these things are so important for their mental health, their ability to trust their own instincts, for their physical growth and their strength
Mm-hmm.
building and all those things. And so it's also, very important for, moms and dads to weigh out that balance of like how do we keep our kids safe but also recognize that risky play is actually also very beneficial as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I believe so much of this comes down to being informed and having conversations, right? So, as opposed to it being what I think often happens is sometimes these things happen in passing, right? You come home and your husband's got the kids on the bike with no helmets and you say, "Where are the helmets?" And, it's not actually a conversation about what expectations are in regards to safety versus risk, right? And so I actually find that the couples probably that are navigating this best are the people who before something happens, they have conversations about it. Like, what's our risk tolerance here for this kind of thing? How do we want to navigate this? And I don't know if you have suggestions in particular and kind of like what is like healthy, safe, risky play versus unsafe, because I think there is this um yeah, there's this balancing act between being informed, but we don't want to be overly informed and constantly mitigating risk for our kids when it could be healthy for them. And so I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, I often come at the approach of there's like the that safety red line that we're not going to cross, right? We're not
Hmm.
going to let our child run into the street without looking, at a certain age. We're not going to let them ride bikes without helmets. We're not
Hmm.
going to, let them jump off the diving board if they can't swim, right? So there have to be definitely things that we know are our kids are not capable of higher level thinking
Yeah.
and that risk awareness where they've gone too far, right? That's where we as parents certainly need to come in and say, okay, these are things that we know are are dangerous, right? There's like that
Hmm.
danger factor, something dangerous, and that we're not going to let them do, right? You might not let your 3-year-old near a flame to let them cook just because you want to like let them be exposed to all the different elements and independence, right? You have to make that decision, and again, as you said, and I'm not naming things that are pretty obvious, but for every family that might look a little bit different of what those dangerous red line things are, right? It
Hmm.
might also be where you live, right? Do you live on a street with sidewalks? Do you live in a dead end street? Do you have a pool in the backyard, right? Like, what are those environmental factors that also play into how you guys as a team are going to determine what those danger factors are and how you're going to safeguard against those things? When you put those things aside that are so important to really have that team-based approach, you then can say, okay, well, what are the other things that we're okay with letting our child explore? And one of the phrases that I've used a lot with my own kids and I use a lot in sessions is one is, do you feel safe? Right? Not near a street where cars are coming, but you're on your swing set in the backyard and they're trying to climb on top of the monkey bars instead of, going on the swing or something. I'll say to my, do you feel safe with that? Does that feel something that you can do? I often also don't help my children with different things. I'll guide them through something without actually physically putting them in things or helping them climb to the top. And I'll say like, okay, I'm not going to help you get there, but if you can get there yourself, then I'm willing to like, I'll stand guard, I'll be around, but I'm not going to like,
Hmm.
physically facilitate it, which sometimes, especially the dads can be like, sure, I'll put you on top of the monkey bars and like walk away. That
Right.
happens sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that is the difference, right? It's kind of what is that boundary? What is that line that we are willing to cross or not cross, and having those conversations in advance. And I think also you mentioned it, but I grew up in a cul-de-sac. I think a lot of people grew up in a cul-de-sac. I grew up in a cul-de-sac. I live in a cul-de-sac now, and I am much more hesitant to let my kids just roam free because now we live in the world of like a million delivery drivers, right? And they fly through our neighborhood. And that didn't exist when I was a kid. Like I remember, my husband and I talk about like I rode my bike and I rollerbladed, but all of my neighbors were parents and they knew to look for kids because they lived there. And that's like there's a sign at the top of the street that says, drive slowly. We love our kids. But in our town now or everywhere basically there's Amazon drivers and UPS and FedEx, and it's my tolerance for letting them be out there by themselves is lower maybe than my parents' tolerance was. And so I think that comes up a lot too, which is this idea of like, well, when I was a kid, this is what I did. And navigating those conversations with the reality of what we know now and what life is like now is also a part of this conversation. And we have to have some like flexibility for it to be different, which I think is sometimes difficult, right? Because we remember our childhood fondly and what we were able to do, and we want that for our kids. And sometimes it's not always possible.
100%. I never thought of the delivery drivers and how often we have people driving on our streets who are not used to being on our streets. That's such an
Yeah.
important point. Um, and the difference of, growing up in the 90s as a 90s child, one of my favorite movies of all time was Now and Then,
Mm.
where the four girls are riding on their bikes and I don't even know where they went, into like different towns and all these things. And like, that was like, my ideal summer experience as a child. And I do find a lot on social media that there's a lot of push of like, that great time back in the day when, right, movies like Now and Then were actually relevant to like what kids wanted to do, right? We wanted to ride our bikes or come in when the street lights, went on. But there is definitely a difference now. There are a lot more
Hmm.
people on the streets that are not just our community members, and that's a really good point in like how have times actually changed. Not just our perception has changed because we have more information, but has actually the world changed? And it has.
Hmm. Yeah, it has. I mean, it just has. Unfortunately, I live walking distance to the schools, but we take the bus because there's no sidewalks, right? I mean, there's all these things that maybe we had access to wherever we were that maybe we don't for our own kids. And so navigating those conversations with the nuance of our lived experience, I think, is really important. It's not a one-to-one comparison to how we were raised. I know a lot of people get frustrated with like in-laws or their own parents who are like, well, when I was a mom, and it's like, yeah, well, things are a little different now, right? And so I think that the risky play is so interesting because in my mom group, there was a video that went around where everybody was saying like, oh, you're not supposed to say careful, like careful, careful, careful. And it's this instinct, right? Like that I think we all have. We're like, oh, be careful, like watch what you're doing. What is your perspective on that? Because I feel like this is a controversial one where people are like, I get it, I'm supposed to let them take risks, but at the same time, I'm trying to navigate their awareness of the risk depending on their age. And so, how do you suggest people kind of go through that?
Sure. Well, number one, you're not saying something wrong if you say be careful, right? Like a lot of times as moms, we're like, wait, I wasn't
Yeah.
supposed to say that. I wasn't supposed to say that phrase. I was supposed to be more gentle in my. So number one, as a mom of four, I think you also have four,
Yes.
I have said be careful 1,000 times over. I've said
Same.
all the wrong phrases all the time, 100 times over. So you're not damaging your kids at all by saying the words be careful. Okay, so that's like number one. The When I have spoken about changing out the phrase be careful to do you feel safe or can you do this on your own, something like that, my message is less about, avoid that phrase and more of bringing your own mindset of like a comfort of allowing your kids to also have some independence. As we
Mm,
said a few moments ago, the world has changed where our parents were not nearly as involved in our play as we are today, right?
hmm.
My parents were not at the playground with me, watching me every minute, taking videos. Right now, my kids will say,
Yeah.
Mom, take a video of me, take a video. My dad will laugh and be like, I never once said that to my mother, and my mother wasn't even looking at me, and I wasn't filming every second of your childhood, right? So there's definitely a different experience where we are also watching our children more than our parents ever watched us.
Hmm.
And as kids, there were definitely things that I did, I'm sure, that like I did climb on top of something. I did take a risk. And I did turn out okay, right? And I think sometimes as parents, we're so we want to be so present. We want to be with them every minute. We want to watch them. We want to engage with them. But it's also a little bit taking away their freedom of exploring and navigating and trying something and problem solving. And so it's also a good healthy balance for us to say yes, I want to be present with my child, I want to be with them on the playground and engage, but I also want to give children the ability to problem solve, to take a little bit of a leadership role in their own. And how do they learn? How do kids learn, especially younger kids? Through play. And so we want to give them, we want to be with them, but we also want to give a little bit of distance to let them navigate themselves. And so, how do we do that when we are present? We are more present than our parents were. And so, I think, again, it's never, you're not saying the wrong thing, but the mindset can also be there of like, I don't have to always say, careful, watch out, don't do this, right? It can be like, okay, wait, I'm watching him do something. I'm not sure. Hey, are you sure you want to do that? How are you going to do that? You know, do you feel safe? Things like that, where we can add that message in, and it's a little bit of changing our own mindset rather than we're saying something harmful to our child, because we're not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing I've always said to, my friends. I say careful all the time, but also, especially with my fourth, if she's trying to keep up with her older siblings, like I have a tolerance for her to try things with me watching. Like I'm watching her. But that doesn't mean I'm not saying be careful sometimes. I think it's hard. It's hard not to do those things as a parent. Like your instinct is to do that. But I do think there's this all or nothing idea, especially on social media for parents, where it's like, if I say careful, I'm doing the wrong thing and I'm going to harm them in some way, when in reality, I think what you're suggesting is that it's kind of both, right? Like you're giving them the space. And I will say, I don't know your thoughts on this, but I think as my kids have gotten older, I have a bit more personally, like I feel a bit more freedom to let them experience that because they already are, right? They're playing on sports teams where I'm not always there. They're at school. I always tell people they have friendships outside of me. Like they have friends that I don't even know who they are. And they have relationships that I don't know about. And they do things on the playground that I don't know about. And on the bus, right? And they're doing all these things outside of me. My eyes are not there. I don't know what's happening. And so I'm a bit more, as my kids have gotten older, and it's given me perspective for my younger kids, is like, yeah, they're going to take risks when I'm not there. And they're going to take risks when I am there. And so how do we work through that, what that looks like? And we were at a birthday party and the kids were being crazy. And I like want to step, as a parent, you're like, you want to step in and be like, guys, like stop. And one of the other parents was like, I think they do this together every day. Like they hang out every day. Like they know how to mitigate this themselves, like how to navigate these friendships themselves. Like we don't have to step in necessarily. And I think that is, it's hard to fight those instincts when we are encouraged. I think we're also encouraged to be much more involved parents than previous generations. It's this idea of, I've seen this where critiquing parents who are on their phone at soccer practice. And to your point, like my mom didn't stay at soccer practice, she left. So we're expected to be there and also be present and be watching. And it's a very different environment to parent in. And it almost feels like we have to consciously push back on that expectation.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, my four kids just came back from sleepaway camp. They were all four away for 4 weeks. I
Wow.
was not, I know it was amazing actually, for them and for me.
Yeah.
But you're right. I wasn't there for everything from how and they just came back and they're telling me about all these different situations that they had with friends that, they're sleeping in a bunk and I want to go to sleep and this one didn't want to go to sleep and all these different things that they navigated on their own. And I wasn't even there I didn't even know what those situations were to worry about it, to think
Yeah.
about it, to, give them tips of how to deal with it. Like this was an opportunity for them to fully take on how to deal with foods that they didn't like and counselors that were being stricter, like all the different things that we navigate as adults, they got the exposure. And it even goes for our younger kids if they are in daycare or they're in school. And there are so many situations where they are living a life that we're not a part of. And
Hmm.
yet we have this pressure today as moms to be so involved in every aspect of their lives. And it's intense and it's a lot of pressure. And as you said, so then you are at the soccer game because you want to be present, but like, how present can we be at a soccer game? I'm not that into soccer, like it's
Yeah.
okay to have, and we also naturally have more distractions than we ever did before. And so it's really finding that balance of being present, being, involved, letting them have their independence, letting them grow independently, and both being okay. And I think I've seen a little bit of a shift in social media, and you're definitely a part of that messaging, where it's I think even a few years ago, there was a lot of this message, right? Be present, we have to fully engage. There are only 18 summers until our children leave us forever, which is just not true. And there's definitely been a pushback of, there can be a middle ground too, and I
Hmm.
think that that's important from everything from playing in your backyard and being present but not, and being at that soccer game and being present and not, and navigating that and not feeling this intense pressure all the time
Hmm.
to I think that that's really important.
Yeah, and that narrative that there's only 18 summers or, as be present, be there. I think it's funny because I look back and I remember my parents taking us to this like bagel place and they sat at a different booth and read the newspaper. And me and my siblings sat in a different booth and like ate our food and chatted. Like they were doing that and it wasn't seen as neglectful or anything. And it wasn't
Right.
like they were just reading the news, right? And I think we have a different version of what that looks like now. But I think I imagine there's a lot of moms who would feel like, while their kids are playing on the swing set, that they have to be engaged in that play and they can't sit there and read their book because they are meant to be involved. And I think what you're saying and kind of what we know is that there actually can be space for both. And I tell women all the time, like, yeah, we only have 18 summers with them, but these are also our 18 summers. Like these are my 18 summers too. Okay.
Yeah.
And I want to enjoy them as well. And that doesn't mean I can't focus on my kids and enjoy my kids and also spend time on other things, right? And give them space to kind
Yeah.
of be on their own. And so I think that's, I was at a conference recently and the author of The Anxious Generation was there. I think Jonathan Haidt, is that how you say his
Yes.
last
Yeah.
name? And he said something about like out by eight, right? He has this motto. And, I am not a huge follower of his work, but he was talking about this in particular and this idea of like, he really wants parents to get comfortable with this idea of like kids kind of like doing something on their own at 8 years old. So like maybe that's if you're in the city walking to the store, if it's you're in the burbs like me, it's riding their bike to a friend's house, something like that. Um, and I find that interesting too, because I think we are, that feels really scary for a lot of parents. And when I look back on my life, I was staying home alone at 10. So it's not much different, right? 8 to 10 years old. Obviously it is, but not that much different. And so, yeah, like how do we do that in this world? Again, Amazon drivers, like I'm afraid for my kid to ride his bike on the street, transparently. Like it makes me very nervous. I've seen how people drive.
Yes.
Um, it's not about him. It's about everyone else, right? That I'm worried about. I think a lot of parents will say that it's not them, it's everything else that I'm worried about.
Yeah.
But I think about that a lot. I think about it all. My son is 8, my oldest is 8. So I think about that all the time, which is like, how am I giving them space to take risk and to explore and to be adventurous? That was the most fun part of my childhood, but also make sure that I'm, keeping them safe as much as I can.
Yeah, it always is a hard balance. And actually, my youngest is 8. I have twins who are 14, 12, and 8. And so I wouldn't say one's easier or harder. Like as they're younger, right? They have no safety awareness around them. You have to really be the one who's always looking out for them, right? And making sure that you're cutting their grapes and that they're, wearing the helmet, all those different things that we have to navigate the danger versus giving them a little bit of freedom to trust themselves a little bit. And as they get older, there's so many more things, right? They want to ride their bike by themselves in the street. They want to walk to their friend's house. They want to be on the internet. All these different things that we have to figure out how to navigate. I think it really goes back to the beginning of our conversation, which is you and your partner together have to have discussions about where do we find those like lines that we need to draw of like where are the ones that as the adults need to make these decisions for our kids of like we're just not comfortable with this, and where are we a little bit able to budge a little bit
Hmm.
because there's and again, this is as our, I mean, from 2 years old they're asking to do things that, you know, we don't think are safe or something like that. And it increases with time because they're also going to come to you and say, but my friend is doing this, my friend is walking to the ice cream store, my friend is, you know, has a phone, my friend has all these different things. And it's, the reality is it's true, right? Like there are going to be different kids who are doing different things. And I think there's a difference between, okay, this is the danger hard line if I'm not crossing. This is
Hmm.
the gray zone where maybe there are accommodations that I can make to feel safer with this, right? So
Hmm.
maybe it's putting in a fence in your backyard so that you feel safe letting your kids outside without you while you're, you know, while they're still young, right? What, like at different ages it's going to look different, right? So we're going to fence in our yard, or we're going to set up some, you know, get a trampoline that has a net around it so they feel, you know, they feel like they have some independence and we feel safe with this, you know, accommodation that we're making. And then as they get older, right, is it that we need to give them an air tag so that we know where they are? Is like, what are those accommodations that we can make to make ourselves feel better, that, you know, partner and I are on the same team about, that we're
Hmm.
discussing? We can make those accommodations where we're giving our child a little bit of the freedom, but, you know, we got a Facebook portal at home that our kids, if when I wanted to start leaving them at home alone, they could, you know, they didn't have a phone themselves, but we had a Facebook portal that they were able to FaceTime us. And so if
Mm.
I was running to the store, I would be on FaceTime with them at home. And I would say, nobody's allowed to eat while I'm not home at a certain age, right? Because choking, like certain things made me too nervous to leave them at home. But there were certain accommodations that I could make to be comfortable with that, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, it's one of those things where we can draw boundaries and have conversations with our partner. You know, we have a pool, so we are very strict about pool safety in our home. And my even my youngest knows the rules. I make her repeat them to me. Like, do you, and she's only 3, so she sometimes does things. I'm like, girl, that's not part of the rules. But you know, she's 3, but we talk about them. And I think that's a part too that we maybe like tiptoe around a bit more in our generation, which is what we share with our kids. You know, I'm a pretty big believer in an age appropriate way telling them why I'm setting a boundary on something. So we've banned YouTube in our house, for example, and I've told them why. And to your point, like they've said, well, my friend watches X, Y, and Z, and I'm like, that's up to their mom and dad. You know, I personally, in our house, this is why we're choosing not to do it. And they can choose to use it for whatever reason. And it's the same thing with a bunch of things, whether it's like, you know, kids with motorized scooters nowadays and all the things. Like every family, my pediatrician actually just said this at our well visit. She's like, you know, your kids are getting older. There's kids who are going to sit in the front seat. There's kids who are going to have an Apple Watch. There's kids who are going to have iPads and or iPhones. And even if you don't, you know, other kids will. And so you need to start navigating that conversation, not just with your partner, but
Yeah.
you and your partner have to be on the same page in how you speak about it to your kids, which I think is also a big part of this conversation, which is helping your kid learn to assess risk and understand the value of something and the negative aspects of something as well.
100%. The pool thing actually reminds me, this was years ago when my youngest was like 2 or 3 years old, and we stayed in an Airbnb in Florida. And my kids are not used to having a pool in their backyard. And there was a pool, and there was, you know, the sliding glass door opened, and there was the pool.
Yeah.
And again, my oldest were maybe 8 at the time, and there's like a 5-year age gap between all of them. And I literally was like, this door doesn't get opened. It stays locked at all times because if you open that door, she can drown. Like I made it, I had to say it over and over. And we
Hmm.
had that conversation of why. And like the hard line of like, do not open the door. I don't want to hear if it's raining. I like nothing. It stays closed at all times. I am the only one who opens it, or dad is the only, you know, and it was something we had to repeat because this was a new environment that they weren't used to. And there was like a conversation that we had, and we had to say why. And even though that might feel a little bit scary, right? Like you don't want to make it sound dangerous. Well, sometimes that's actually the conversation that needs to be had because it's just that risky.
Yeah, yeah, and that's how I feel about our pool in
Yeah.
particular. Like my 3-year-old will tell people, if I go out there without mom and dad, I could drown. Because
Right.
she knows, and because we talk about it constantly and how it's so important, not just for us, but for our neighbors and our friends who come over to have pool safety. And so, yeah, I'm a big believer in an age appropriate way. You know, having these conversations with our kids about risk as well and the dangers of certain things and what safety looks like. Because I think that's part of the conversation too, which is to your point of like, do you feel safe right now? sometimes our kids, I don't think, have the context as to what's safe, right? And so maybe pools are a good example of that. But yeah, how are you going to get down from here on a play gym? How are you going to?
Right.
Sure, you can do that, but how are you going to get down?
Yeah,
Like how?
exactly, exactly. And so, and that's really where comes the balance of the conversations that you have with your partner and the conversations that you have with your kids, right?
Yes.
And sometimes the conversations are just enough to get them to start thinking, to problem solve, to work
Mm,
it out themselves. So, because even as we're discussing this, it's so interesting how when kids do get older, right, they're going to be exposed to more, they're going to have more questions, they're going to be curious about why not, and we have to kind of bring up of what is safe and what's not and have those discussions,
hmm.
and starting off that thought process when they're younger is extremely helpful, so we're not just starting that conversation when they're 8 or 9 or 10. It's
Right.
starting when they're much younger in those toddler years of being aware of safety to the capacity that they're capable of understanding.
Right. Yeah. Totally agree.
Yeah, no, it's so great, and this has been such a great discussion. And to round it out, really that discussion of there's so much there's so much room for nuance in every family and what
Hmm.
feels comfortable for them, and understanding that whatever you see on social media, there's there's always the like, here's what we're saying on social media and here's maybe how you can apply it for your own self, your own family. It's helpful to have social media because I sometimes find like, oh, I didn't think of it like that, or I
Right.
didn't, I wasn't aware of that idea, or I am so nervous. Maybe there is some room to allow my kids to explore a little bit more, but it always has to feel comfortable at home with where you're at.
Yes. Totally agree. I tell people, whether it's a method or a system, you have to make that system work for your life. You can't always fit your life into a system, right?
Exactly.
So I think you take what works and what is helpful to your family and you apply it and leave what doesn't, excluding like real safety things, leave what doesn't. And,
Yeah.
move forward in a way that kind of acknowledges the nuance you mentioned.
Yeah, every child is different. You might have a very
Hmm.
impulsive child who really can't make decisions, and you might have that super cautious child who needs a little nudge to go explore a little bit more. So there's always room for that nuance, and I think that's the conversations matter in helping to really decide what you guys at home are comfortable with.
Totally agree.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much
Thank you.
for chatting with me. I think this was really great, and I loved our discussion.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, have a great day, Paige. Take
You
care.
too.
Bye
Bye.
bye.